welcome back, everybody, to the third session of the conference today. I'm Tracy Isaacs. I'm a professor in philosophy at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada, and I'm a 59-year-old brown cisgendered woman of color of South African origin. I have short cropped graying hair and dangly earrings. And as I said, I'm in London, Ontario. I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinanton peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. There's closed captioning available for the webinar. It's in the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for the Q&A, please use the Q&A button and not the comments so that we can keep track of those questions. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And just also thank you to Shelley and Joe and the entire organizing team for your hard work in putting the conference together for us. It's been great so far. The speaker for this session is T. Virgil Murthy, a PhD candidate at Carnegie Mellon, with forthcoming work in the Feminist Philosophy Quarterly, among other papers. And Virgil runs the Addict Collective blog on Substack. And the title of the talk today is Welfarism for Thee, but Not for Me, Intergenerational Erasure and Building Addict and Mad Joy. Virgil.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Professor Isaacs, for that lovely introduction. Are my slides running? Looks like everything is good. I'm going to start my timer. So my presentation is called Welfarism for Thee, but Not for Me. And I'm going to talk about what it means to build addict and mad joy in the shadow of this thing that I'll describe called intergenerational erasure. So first of all, I want to reiterate the available captioning via Zoom. I want to provide a brief visual description. So I am a young biracial brown person wearing a russet sort of like sweater, a gold chain, and I have sort of black bangs that are peeking out from under a beanie. And I want to give a brief content warning that I'm going to be talking about suicide and murder. I'm going to be talking about pro-sterilization rhetoric, institutionalization, some of the common topics of eugenics and disability oppression. So I want to start out with some definitions because the major subject of this discussion will be mad people and addicts, which are the identity groups with which my research is here concerned. So what does it mean to be mad? What is a mad person? The general consensus in mad studies seems to hinge on certain ways in which people's behavioral expressions are presumed to be motivated by atypical emotions, pathologized emotions, and pathologized perceptions of reality. And in particular, these people, mad people, are people whose emotive and perceptive relationships to the world and to, objective reality is considered to be atypical, is considered to be different from other people's relationship to the world. Equivalently, these people are the members of an identity group, an oppressed group, and the oppression of that group is called mad oppression. Its liberation is called mad liberation, and prejudice against this group is called sanism. So in keeping with that is the way in which I define the wheelhouse of concepts that I use to talk about addicts in my research. Addicts are the people, similarly, whose behavioral expressions are presumed to be motivated by atypical consumption patterns of substances or actions, atypical attitudes toward those substances or actions. And there is a similar sort of world or objective reality reflexive dependence that is used by often medical models of this kind of person. It is presumed that these substances and actions, there is a default relationship to them and a normal relationship to them. Often they are carceralized or made to have an idea that you should use them in moderation in light of that kind of notion of reality or of how the world works. More reductively, we might say that these are the people whose substance use patterns are considered atypical from the self-fancied standpoint of being a normal person, of being an abled person. Analogously, the members of this group are the people who are subjected to addict oppression. This isn't tautological. I independently characterize what addict oppression is, and so it's not just sort of a circular definition. And prejudice against this identity group is something that I call dampism, which I talk about a little bit recently in my guest post on biopolitical philosophy. Dampism is the justificatory logic of addict oppression in the same way that sanism is the logic of mad oppression. And crucially, all of these bullet points end up being equivalent definitions. They seem different, but everything works together here and locks into a system of oppression. So basically, I come at this from an ameliorative perspective, but I'm sufficiently, Foucaultian or critical of the way that we use terminology that it's also just descriptive. This is the way that these people are conceptualized. This is the experience of being this sort of person in the world. All right, so let's get started. My first section is called A Tale of Two Theories. I'm going to lay out two different sort of like value theories that are persistent in the modern literature. And I have here a picture of an older disabled activist holding up a sign that says, "Assist us to live, not to die," which is obviously a reference to the encroaching euthanasia state. So I have here three different panels with three images on them that are clipped from recent articles or publications. And I'm doing something that I often do, which is here are some dispatches from the discourse. What do they have in common? What do we learn from them? So the first one is a clip from an article called American Madness, which is a sort of like bio piece on a person named Michael Laudor, who is schizophrenic and who very famously and in a high profile case committed a murder, murdered his fiancée, and who is now being used in a sort of cynical manner to create justification for the encroaching institutionalization of mad people. And I've had here clipped a passage in which the author of the article writes favorably of the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, who plans to create a much greater impetus toward institutionalization in the city. There's an intrinsic humanitarian imperative not to stand by idly while these people waste away, is what he quotes the director of a program at Columbia as saying. Similarly, I have another article here that's titled "The Politics of Addiction. Newsom sees forced treatment as a solution, but doctors have their doubts." This is a reference to Newsom's similar plan to increase the forced treatment capacities for addicts in California. Then also I have a clip from Anthony Appiah's ethicist column that is titled "My Grandmother Has Alzheimer's. Do I Need to Keep Visiting Her?" The magazine's ethicist columnist on the obligations we have to relatives who can no longer remember us. And there's a picture of an elderly woman who seems to be isolated and by herself in a little bubble surrounded by people living their lives. Then finally, there's a clip from a public access article in Pediatrics about pubertal suppression for transgender youth and risk of suicidal ideation. And the results demonstrate that suicide risk is lowered for trans youth who receive PBT. So the commonality between these three resources here, I think, is a certain kind of rhetorical spin on the lives of marginalized people, where what's really apparent is these people aren't being regarded by the people writing about them as individuals with complicated interests and complicated lives. It's a very simple binary. They need to be made comfortable. So often, instead of focusing on the expansion of possibilities, the way in which trans youth can be able to explore and create possibilities for themselves by taking, cross-sex hormones and by taking PBT, the rhetoric is, well, we need to make them not miserable because that's what they are. It's a highlighting of negatives and a fundamentally perceived negative experience. Similar in this article about the grandmother with Alzheimer's, she isn't perceived as an individual with an identity, with a relationship to the world. She's perceived as sort of like an item, almost a thing. And she's described in Appiah's column as sort of like a grave, a memorial to the past. And finally, in these articles about the encroaching institution state, the very clear rhetoric is, well, these people need to be kept safe from themselves. They need to be placated. It's a humanitarian impulse. So this is very strange when you consider it in keeping with the way in which modern philosophy generally works. We have what I would call a non-welfarist consensus. Contemporary philosophers generally agree that the features of the good life are a little more complicated than just straight up hedonism. First of all, there's multiple of them. You can have some and you can lack others. Then they're also person specific. The good life is actualized through choice. It's actualized through autonomy. It's actualized through becoming a sort of person. So it's challenge based and based in change. There's a process, there's an arc of your life. And I have here two images that are reflective of this general way that we talk about the good life. One is sort of a pinwheel that describes the various different ways in which people can self-actualize, such as universalism, benevolence, conformity, tradition, security, power, achievement. The other one is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Right, so you start out with physiological needs at the bottom of the pyramid, then safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. Self-actualization being this sort of fundamentally non-welfarist view of becoming a sort of thing in keeping with your human agency. So this is a pretty strong consensus, right? Brain state hedonism and the desire satisfaction theory do not properly capture why life is valuable. And this is really reflected across not just the ethics of, the modern philosophy, but pop psych literature, which contemporarily emphasizes self-direction. You need to be guided by long-term, but ultimately realistic objectives for your life. And in particular, the good life requires some discomfort. This is a very common theme in modern pop psych literature. I have here a picture of a book by Krista K. Thomason called Dancing with the Devil, Why Bad Feelings Make Life Good. I have a clip from an interview with psychologist Paul Bloom on the importance of suffering. It's called A Good Life is Painful. And a study that's titled, Does Growth Require Suffering? And it's a review and meta-analysis. But it is, again, in keeping with this pattern that suffering is necessary, that you need to be able to confront your discomfort and overcome it. Record scratch. I have here a picture of a record that is scratched. Unless you're disabled. So, and this is the fundamental tension here that I want to get into, and it's this thing that I call welfarism for thee, but not for me. This is a quote from one of my blog posts, and I have here accompanying a picture of the famous woman titled Ashley X, who was controversially and involuntarily subjected as a child to a bunch of invasive medical procedures, including double mastectomy, including growth reduction systematically, and including hysterectomy, because it was presumed that because she was intellectually disabled, why would she need to make use of a uterus? Why would she need to make use of breasts? We need to alleviate the apparent discomfort that she might feel as those things develop, and keep her a child forever, which is very straightforwardly the logic that her parents expressed in their blog about it. So here's the quote. Abled people reflexively presume disabled interests are not as complex as their own. They endorse a two-tiered conception of the good. For the abled, well-being is multifaceted. It requires challenge, pain, or discomfort for the achievement of greater goods. But for the disabled, well-being is simple. They should be made comfortable. The story of Ashley X and the prevailing intuition that intellectually disabled people cannot have consensual, non-harmful sex reflect the view that disabled people simply cannot ever access the higher plane of Mill taxonomy of pleasures. We're given to understand there's no way in which these people can self-realize. They therefore need to be pacified. I call this mindset welfarism for thee, but not for me. It is particularly rampant, not among militant eugenicists who don't care about disabled lives in the first place, but among those who style themselves as allies. And this is an important point to which I'll return in the presentation. I also want to briefly mention an important contemporary contribution to the discourse made by Catherine Frazee, who gave a very important speech at the disability filibuster on Bill C-7, asking, Bill C-7 begs the question, why us? Why only us? Why not everyone who lives outside the margins of a decent life? Everyone who resorts to an overdose, a high bridge, a shotgun carried out into the woods. So in other words, this is a question of why do the architects of this policy seem to be focused on alleviating suffering as a primary goal and function only when it's disabled suffering? I have here a picture of Catherine, who is smiling at the camera wearing a silk scarf. So the conclusion here is that the modern push for mass institutionalization and these other kinds of articles that we've looked at highlight sympathy toward mad people and addicts, or to put them together, I like to use the term addicts. We're not dangerous individuals. We are, which is sort of like the rhetoric that the carceral system has traditionally relied on. We are people failed by society. And some of this rhetoric is cynical, of course, but a lot of it is sincere, especially the appeals made by Maddox themselves in order to justify this overreach. But a crucial supporting premise in it, which I think is very important to question, is that society's primary obligation toward Maddox is to relieve their distress. And then these institutions are the ones that can best do it. So let's all be, locked up in the modern, Willowbrook, but nicer. But that isn't how we talk about sane distress. This isn't the way that you hear people discuss the kinds of, suffering and discomfort that sane, abled people have to confront. So clearly, there's a different value theory at play here that is justifying this overreach in the case of Maddox. And then to give us another why is it that people assume this two-tiered value theory? Why is it that we have this two-tiered conception of the good? And for this, I'm going to introduce the framework of intergenerational erasure. So I have here a new section, section 2, intergenerational erasure in the eugenic state. And I have pictures of 3 sort of major political officials who are also big public spokespeople regarding MAID and or the institution state. So one is Eric Adams of New York. Then in the middle here, I have Carolyn Bennett, who's the mental health and addiction czar in Canada. And then I have David Eby, who's the minister of British Columbia. So intergenerational erasure is a term that I use and I'm trying to popularize the use of to relate to a specific sort of institutional behavior, a set of systems that accomplish a particular kind of goal. So again, I'm going to give a list of examples and then I'm going to explain what I mean by this. An addict who was convicted in the United States of passing a bad check, so something totally unrelated to child neglect, was advised by a judge to present medical evidence establishing that she has been rendered incapable of procreation. He was asking for sterilization proof, and she got sterilized, and he lightened her sentence, and he explicitly said it was because she got sterilized. Another example, Senator Randy Smith, again of the U.S., explicitly advises addicts to get your tubes tied so you don't bring any more drug babies into the system. I have here at the bottom of this slide a picture of Abby Lynn Steele. She was an indigenous meth addict who died under very suspicious circumstances. Police footage was never released in a South Dakota county jail. She had 2 children, both of whom were taken, and she was charged with felony drug ingestion, which is a loophole felony that only exists in South Dakota. And justice for Abby Steele is still like a very important rallying call within missing and murdered Indigenous women movements. The nonprofit Project Prevention pays addicts $200 for proof of sterilization. And I have here 2 billboards that are run by Project Prevention, which was previously called CRACK. One says, she has her daddy's eyes and her mommy's heroin addiction with a picture of a crying baby. The other says, if you are addicted to drugs, get birth control, get $200 cash. And the founder of Project Prevention says, we don't allow dogs to breed, and yet these women are literally having litters of children. And finally, one more thing is that pregnant women, like 26 of them were studied in a qualitative study recently by Schiff et al. And they reported that they were addicts, they were on mood or medically assisted buprenorphine opioid treatment. They were pressured by staff to terminate their pregnancies, and staff exerted really undue influence and pressure into their medication regimens. So here's a picture of a tweet from my own Twitter account, which I'm happy to platform here in my presentation, from April, in which I write, every successful liberation project you can name has been carried out as an intergenerational endeavor, firmly grounded in communities that existed long enough through, having children to develop and refine hermeneutics, resources, projects to combat oppression. And then I've written some commentary beneath that screenshot of my tweet that says, plenty of advocates for these initiatives that I've described to you, for these county judges, these advocates for Project Prevention, the advocates for MAID, don't at least facially seem to adhere to the medical model of disability. A lot of them actually are social model advocates. And their endeavor to curtail disabled people from surviving and having children doesn't seem to stem from the same kind of able genetic exceptionalism that old school eugenics does. It's a different sort of motivation. And if you think about it in terms of Abby Lynn Steele, if you think about it in terms of the systematic separation of Indigenous children from their parents, the systematic separation of Black children from their parents, systematic separation of disabled people's children, it doesn't seem like eugenics. It seems like strike breaking. And that is the reason that I ultimately developed this framework of intergenerational erasure. It is the anti-disabled activism version of strike breaking levied by ableism. So intergenerational erasure is that disabled people are systematically prevented from creating families and communities that persist across time. And of course, this isn't merely restricted to the locus of pregnancy and childbirth. It's also community-based. Children who are being raised within communities, who are participating in communities, who are doing activism in communities, are being taken out of those communities and redistributed elsewhere. There's carceralism and institutionalization. When individual intellectually disabled people are separated from communities, identitarian communities, and placed in institutions and assisted living facilities. Participation in intergenerational projects such as theory building, such as child rearing, education, planning for movement advocacy is withheld from these groups. And for Maddox, this incapacitation is often justified by the claim that we're dangerous, but that clearly isn't what's doing the actual justificatory work, because the mechanisms of social isolation perpetuated by intergenerational erasure persist for people who are very obviously not dangerous according to the socially constructed notion, of dangerous individual according to Foucault. It persists in people who are quote unquote successfully assimilated. The dangerousness is obviously not the deep down thing that's going on here. And it often functions by appealing to the need for us to stay non-dangerous. But deep down, I do think that it's about this welfareism for thee but not for me thing, which is why I brought it up. So the upshot is that intergenerational erasure involves eugenics. Eugenics is sort of like a wing of it, or the two are related, but it's broader in scope and it has a different objective. Its objective is not to eliminate disabled people, it's to keep us complacent. And why is that the case? Why is it that modern institutions of disabled oppression are concerned so much with complacency and with, eradicating disabled community? Well, the reason is that disabled people aren't economic deadweight. We aren't a population surplus. These perceptions, of course, are ableist, and it is obvious that disabled people do all sorts of important, work. Even work that is legible by the lights of neoliberal society. These theories are wrong, because of course disabled people contribute to the economy, and of course disabled people actually create a lot of jobs, as is something that Adler, Bolton, and Vierkandt discuss in their new book, Health Communism. Disabled people, sort of are subjected to a kind of resource extraction. But what we see is that, as with a bunch of other systems of oppression, the apparatus of disability facilitates extraction of labor and capital from disabled people, the same way that systems perpetuating poverty are set up, the same way that systems of racialization are set up to enforce complacency among racialized people. The same way that colonization works to extract resources and labor from colonized people. The objective is not to eliminate us. It is to make us behave, to make us be okay with our oppression, basically, and behave in ways conducive to economic productivity. So we've seen a lot of neoliberal developments from some theories into others. Disability theories have changed over time. Society at large went from a moral model on which disability results from weak character or sinful action, and oppression of disabled people is justified by blameworthiness, you did something wrong, to a medical model where disability is a pathological defect in body or mind, and there's this, sudden and sort of fixated focus on a curative intervention and a restoration to typicality. And then nowadays, a lot of moderates seem to appeal to a kind of social model, or the British social model of disability, where disability does result from a fundamental objective impairment in body or mind, but we try to value neutralize it. And this is still ultimately conducive, I think, to disabled oppression, because it reduces its focus to individualized modes of access rather than on systemic change. We've seen similar changes over time in the justifications for carceralism, in the same way that we've seen logic change in the justifications of disability oppression. previously we relied on a very retributivist system of carceralism, where justification for incarceration is blame and deviance of the incarcerated. And nowadays, most people appeal to a more rehabilitativist justification, where there's, again, a pathological explanatory reasoning, and it's about curing people, restoring them to typicality. And I guess what will come next will be a sort of analogy to the social model, which we're already starting to see, indeed spouted by some of the same people like David Eby, who are running the institution crackdown. But we see these theories change over time. And the reason that they change is that they are meant to implement different goals. And that's what intergenerational erasure is. It is a new variant of eugenics, and it's conducive to the particular way in which disabled people are supposed to behave in relation to the modern neoliberal state. Eugenics makes you explicit reference to genetics and heritability. It mandates a kind of genetic essentialism. Intergenerational erasure does not do that. It requires no obvious reference to genetics. It doesn't invoke charges of racist pseudoscience, and it facilitates buy-in by defenders of the social model. The concern is about generational trauma in a lot of cases. The concern is about, well, you know, you're addicted to a substance. You just can't be trusted to be a good parent. It has nothing to do with our concern about addict genes, but the result is the same. Eugenics' explicit objective is to prevent future disabled lives and end current ones. With intergenerational erasure, this goal is at least plausibly deniable. And as I mentioned before, often it just isn't the goal at all. Just as it is very important to the perpetuation of capitalism that poor people exist and that labor is extracted from them, it is very important to the future of neoliberalism built often on the labor and on extraction from disabled people that they continue to exist and not start organizing. Eugenics requires physical violence. Intergenerational erasure can, again, be plausibly deniable about the violence that it requires. And both of them alike prevent disabled people from organizing because you simply cannot organize if you are all in separate institution beds. That is not a community. You cannot get together and reason and reckon about what the nature is of your oppression. So these are all advantages of intergenerational erasure by the lights of neoliberalism. Society can continue exploiting disabled people. In accordance with the welfareism for thee but not for me rule, it appears to treat existing disabled people well. It's compatible with our perceived welfarist interests. Because if what matters is placating us, then institutions' problem is that they aren't cushy enough, not that they exist. It gives a non-eugenic justification for the same things that eugenicists are doing, such as sterilization, abortion, mistreatment of pregnant people, separation of families, and so on, incarceration. And this is the central kind of hermeneutical development of intergenerational erasure that I think really clinches it as the thing that we need to be wary of and sort of like the successor movement to eugenics. It capitalizes on certain kinds of rhetorical gambits that have historically been exploited and used in other circumstances of oppression rhetoric, such as anti-queer subordination and racialized oppression. The primary thing that intergenerational erasure, I think, can justify that eugenics cannot is social contagion is a real thing we should worry about. The medical model in certain ways is not really compatible with with an explanatory theory of social contagion that results in the view that we, mad people, addicts, disabled people, are threatening your children. Intergenerational erasure, which being that it is compatible with this less explicitly genetic theory of disability, is conducive to that kind of fear mongering. And we see here, I've clipped some pictures from news articles again, these ones having to deal with the current news hysteria about children becoming spoonies because they watch TikTok videos. There's a current really, emblematic news craze about self-diagnosed autistic and ADHD presentation, about factitious disorder, about schizophrenia being contracted through TikTok. And I included also here a picture of an article about how the transgender social contagion took over this Alaska town, because we can see the rhetoric is very similar. These people, this undesirable oppressed population, if they are allowed to engage with society and with each other, will overtake the rest of society. So the final thing that I want to talk about is rejoicing. because that was ostensibly in the title of this presentation. And so far, I haven't talked about it, and instead it looks pretty bleak. I have here a picture of a pride parade. And it's really like a very beautiful image of rainbow balloons and rainbow pool noodles and a group of people walking, holding up these giant balloons that say pride. It's a queer pride parade. Why do we do this? Why do we have pride parades? Why do we have disability pride? Why do we have queer pride? Because it actually is fun and cool to be us. And that I think it's very easy from an ameliorative standpoint to regard the fundamental lived experience of disability as inherently negative, not because of essential reasons, but because oppression is the constitutive condition of disability. But the other constitutive condition of disability is this perception of having a pathological mind or body. And we can take pride in our minds and bodies as non-pathological, and that's where this impetus toward pride comes from. So while we have a bunch of liberal unhelpfulness in keeping with the welfarism for thee but not for me view, on this slide I have a back and forth between Pierre Poilievre and Carolyn Bennett, who are arguing about safe supply. They're each saying that the other one will kill more addicts. That is the only way that neoliberals know how to argue about safe supply, is by arguing about which one will kill more addicts, because they cannot conceptualize addicts as people with interests more complicated than living or dying. While this rages on, while this sort of unhelpfulness about whether about a conception of disability is fundamentally just being alive. If you're alive, then that's the best that we can do for you. While that rages on, all sorts of disabled activists are creating phenomenological research, are creating testimony, are describing in absolutely soaring terms the experience of disability, the experience of madness, the experience of addiction. So, I have here a reference to my own blog, which I will shamelessly plug. I've run this blog called The Addict Collective, in which most of what we do is theory development. Why is it that people think these things of us? But also, I talk a lot on there about the experience of being an addict and what it is like. And there are features of it that I know ultimately are related inseparably to the kind of pathologization to which addicts are subjected, but which nonetheless end up being interesting and beautiful in their own right. Perceptions and community solidarity and events. I have here a picture of a blog that I know called Trans Panic, which is about transmasculine theory, the theory of transmasculine identity. And again, is focused on intra-community hermeneutical development. Obviously, I have a picture of the logo and name for the Biopolitical Philosophy blog, which is again one of these beautiful, exalting projects in the rejoicing that we find within these kind of community spaces. I'm going to wrap it up here and be done. But I just gave a talk at APHA with Joe Stromando, a picture of whom is in this central panel here on my slide. Joe Stromando is a smiling man wearing like a cabbie cap. He has a brown beard. He's in a green sweater. And a small piece of his power chair is visible in the bottom left of the photo. He gave a wonderful presentation about how his use of assistive technology conveys disability pride by having on his power wheelchair, he has a sort of like a kid carrying plank, a little cabin that his kids can ride around on. And he has pictures of him and his kids riding, and then like an enormous stuffed animal all on this kid carrying plank of his power chair, because that is disabled rejoicing. That is what it is like to live in this universe where there are families. And the powerful immediate descriptor that disabled people can and do have communities and families. We can and do engage intergenerationally. And we use being disabled to do that. I find that very powerful. And finally, to sort of like, it may seem like this is just me talking about my friend's projects, but I have also here a picture of Eli Clare standing in front of a mountain range. He writes beautifully about the phenomenological experience of disability, and connects it explicitly to activism in a way that I think is necessary. This is the way to combat the welfarism for thee but not for me theory, because obviously disabled interests are far more complex than being made comfortable. And in many ways, more complex than analogous perspectives from the abled standpoint. This provides a certain kind of insight that cannot be had otherwise. So finally, I want to give a shout out to my friend and the co-founder of the Addict Collective blog, who passed away in October very suddenly. But she was sort of like a perfect metonym for disabled rejoicing. Anna's addict status was such a critical and central feature of her identity in a way in which she related to the world, and something that she loved to express in connection to her attitudes, in connection to her wardrobe, in connection to her community organizing at packing parties and at protests. I think it would be a better world if we were all a little bit more like her. And finally, I think that like Indigenous oppression is ongoing. I live in Pittsburgh, which is historically Indigenous territory. And I want to sort of give a shout out to the Council of Three Rivers American Indian Center, which is in Pittsburgh, if you would like to get involved in Indigenous organizing. I also recommend reaching out. There's a really critical ongoing upstate New York issue where the IAB has created this really complicated power struggle and sort of like installed a dictator into the Cayuga Nation. So please look into this, and also call your senator and ask for a ceasefire if you haven't already. So yeah, some acknowledgements and thanks. Thanks for listening. I ran a little bit over.
Thank you, Virgil. That was fantastic. Thanks so much. So the Q&A is open for business. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. Meanwhile, we have a question from Cecilia that is in the panelist chat. Thank you, T, for your talk. I thought it was really great. I thought the connection you were making between the extraction of resources from disabled people and policies of eugenics, especially the idea that eugenics can inhabit activism through mobilization for disabled people. It seemed to me that the role that family plays in such activism plays a significant role in your argument. Is this correct? And will you please elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I talk a lot about family separation largely because this is the way in which a lot of current communities are organized. Generally the way in which I perceive the way forward for disability activism and activism in general involves communities on a more broad scale. And in particular, I want to sort of distance myself from any advocation of like nuclear families as like any sort of precondition for disability activism. Family, so obviously there's a lot of conceptualization of family within disabled spaces as something more complicated and transgressive and, you know, expansive than nuclear families. And in particular, the role of biology or of genetics in family is rightly contested. Family, in the way that I think it is particularly conducive to intergenerational politics and intergenerational activism, is facilitating children's increasing familiarity with the spaces and with the oppressed communities into which they are, you know, raised and educated. So one of the sort of, you know, fundamental, I think, examples of how we see here that the eradication of family can interfere with the objectives of activism is that the interference of, you know, government separation of children from, of course, in a very sort of like concrete sense, from natal families into which they're born, but in a way that effectively functions in a sort of plausibly deniable way, but a way that is very important, separation from a relevant, oppressed, marginalized identity community. So we see this tremendously with rhetoric around racialized drug users and addicts. And the stories, I mean, the stories are plentiful. Pregnant addicts are extremely demonized, you know, of course, and in particular, Black and otherwise racialized and Indigenous pregnant addicts are regarded as fundamental threats to the safety of children. But in combination with the hysteria that we've had around since the crack panic of the 80s and the sort of like tentative ICWA, which almost fell last year, what we have is a system of moving children who are ostensibly participating in marginalized communities out of those communities into spaces where they don't engage and interact with the community figures they otherwise would have. They're raised and educated by different people, usually by people who do not share that marginalized identity and who will not provide them, you know, sort of like an understanding of what this kind of oppression means. This is, you know, like a fundamental attribute of how strike breaking works. We have taken people who not only were going to be like, you know, warm bodies in a sense, like at a protest, but who were very important to carrying on protest persistent across time. And now the world will be otherwise. They won't be able to help instantiate that objective because they're being educated in like a hermeneutics that is not fundamentally in conversation with disabled experience or with Black experience or with Indigenous experience. Like the children of disabled people grow up not understanding the history of disabled activism, which is far more likely if they're raised by abled people who aren't in communication with the disabled community than if they're raised by disabled people or by abled allies. Then disability activism lives and dies for one generation, which is also, I think, you can see the same logic in anti-trans oppression, the systematic effort to separate quote unquote trans ideology or gender ideology from children and from classrooms. I don't think it's really motivated by fear. I think it's motivated by tactics. If trans people are not able to communicate with trans youth, and if trans youth is not able to seize a hold of the already like extensive trans hermeneutic resources that exist, then trans activism lives and dies in one generation. And that ultimately is the argument.
Thank you. Okay, there's a question in the Q&A from Luana. Thanks, Virgil. This is great. I'm wondering if you would include vaccines against addiction as one practice or generative outcome of intergenerational erasure. I have recently seen a wealth of articles justifying their coercive use for specific populations, aka poor non-white people, and they explicitly or implicitly use welfarist accounts. It seems to me that this is a good prototype to think about some sort of new immunogenetics in the lines you've been thinking. For example, coercively immunizing the ones failed by society and framing that as a final solution in lots of quotes.
Thank you. I appreciate the question. And I think you're totally right. So I interviewed on my blog a while back Waithera Sebutindira, who's also an addict activist and a very cool person. They just wrote a book called Through an Addict's Looking Glass, about addict communities as like ground zero for mutual aid in disability politics. It's very beautiful and a really good model of like what I'm talking about when I talk about addict activism. And I had them on and we talked about some of these addiction vaccines that Luana, if I may, describes. There's and then also stuff like Ozempic or what have you, which is sort of like a similar kind of logic, and it also applies to addiction, but the major avenue there is fat oppression. I think that this is a very apt analogy, and I think it's in particular, it really incisively explains how the function of this is different from the function of eugenics, even when the mechanisms are the same. There is a sort of immunoeugenics kind of situation here, right? That we are going to inject something into somebody to interfere with the workings of their biology and make them different. But in actuality, what it's functioning as clearly is a conversion therapy. It is a forced assimilation. And this kind of course of assimilation is in order to make it such that we can continue extracting resources from these people without there being their organization and community threatening the order that says that they should contribute to society while continuing to be marginalized. So I think that's an example of this for sure.
Okay, thank you. And then now there's a question from the panelist group from Mish. It's interesting that the anti-TikTok narrative construes people taking control of narratives about their own lives as negative. Could it be that they're afraid that if disabled people define disability on our own terms, government bureaucracies can't police, discipline, and disenfranchise us as easily? Wonderful presentation, Virgil.
Thanks, Mish. Yes. I think that's half of it. And the other half is the more mad people there are, the bigger a coalition we are. And those two things together sort of jointly explain. First of all, more mad consciousness, like raising mad consciousness, is very bad for mad oppression, and mad oppression seeks to prevent that from happening. Second of all, more mad people who are advocating for mad liberation is sort of like, in a very number sense, just, bad. And I think I draw analogies when I talk about intergenerational erasure. I draw a lot of analogies to historical uses of various kinds of institutions to enforce obedience rather than to kill or destroy. Those are often like sorted alongside genocide. And it's not that I think they're not bad or not as bad, it's that I think they fulfill a different, still nefarious purpose. For instance, you see a lot of stuff involving language for the history of deaf oppression, the history of Indigenous oppression, and the history of Black oppression. All just looking at the locus of the United States and Canada, all of those oppressed groups were made to have different relationships to language than they otherwise would have. It was made illegal under slavery, like in a bunch of states, for slaves to be literate and to teach slaves to read and write. And the reason why is obviously that the slavers did not want them reading liberationist texts, of which there was an abundance. And you see the same thing with the like systematic eradication and elimination of deaf people's use of sign language historically. The forcing at Indian schools of Indigenous children to use English and to not use tribal languages. The hermeneutics, people from marginalized communities who are isolated are made to engage in ways that avoid them learning the marginalized hermeneutics, because in them lies community solidarity. Whereas in the mainstream hermeneutics lies a totally different picture.
Thank you. So we have just like 2.5 minutes left. So here's the last question from the Q&A from Hypatia of Spa. I have a question to the idea of pride at the end. If disability defines itself by the relation of our bodies and minds to the world and to an unfittingness to it, to not use words of evaluation, that's in parentheses, how can there be any kind of uniting function of pride that connects these groups outside of this oppositionality? In other words, if there are many such contents of identity, is this idea of disability pride not at risk of defining itself again by its opposite?
Yeah, thank you, Hypatia. I'm glad you asked this question, because I didn't have enough time. You never really have enough time. This is a very tricky question. The short answer is sort of Foucaultian, which is that, yeah, I think the fundamental definition of disability, like insofar as it can be identified as like indexed to a concrete group of people, which is still contingent, and that group of people will change over time, and the meaning of the term will change over time, is that a system of oppression that marks out these people. But then those people start to identify as disabled, and they meet each other, and they talk about their oppression, and they create liberation efforts. And in that identity reclamation, in that community sort of, intra-orientation, arises pride, arises this sentiment. It's really cool to be like these other people. And I sort of agree in a trivial sense that there's not really an object to the pride. If there is nothing, like essential about disability, then there's nothing essential to take pride in. But I don't think that the object of disability pride is in fact essential. I think that the object of disability pride is extremely contingent and dependent, and it is community membership and the phenomenological experiences of community. the particular bodies that community members have that are pathologized in virtue, you know, like in virtue of, you know, a sort of like normative standpoint, right? Which are like, and of course, the thing that makes those bodies different from the abled body is a matter of discourse and a matter of force relations. And like, yes, but still the taking pride in them reflects something real, albeit something that is contingent rather than essential. And the fact that it's contingent rather than essential doesn't weaken it and doesn't make its object less important or less real. Sorry, I'm rambling, but yeah, like I understand the question, and that's my response.
Thank you. So we're gonna have to call it there. There is one more question in the Q&A, Virgil. I think you can go and type in an answer if you want. But we're at the end of the session. So thank you very much for your awesome talk and really good Q&A. Thank you. If everyone wants to join me in thanking Virgil, and we will take a break until the next session, which I believe is in 10 minutes, the Bloomsbury Guide launch.
Thanks so much for moderating, Professor. And I will also, I'll put
You
my
can call me Tracy. Anybody here can call me.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it, Tracy. I will put my email in the chat as well. And thank you so much for the lovely comments and questions.